So we should now be live, I believe. So welcome to anybody who is watching this later as well. Thanks for joining us. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it from me. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Stephen. Oh, heard my own voice there. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, I'm Stephen Jeffries, pronouns he, him. We're thanks to NSUN for giving us this space for the Survivor Research Network. Running this session slightly differently to the other panel discussions, if you've been to them, in that we do very much want to involve all of you in the discussion. I'm going to hand over first to Jackie, who is going to say a few words about SRN and our new CIC. And then we're going over to Dina, who's going to do the main presentation. And then we'll have plenty of time for discussion, and you can put questions in the chat or indeed use the raise hand tool, which I'm hoping is still there with reactions to actually speak directly if you wish to. So I'll go over to Jackie.
Thanks, Stephen. So for those people that aren't aware as yet, I'm hoping that there's not many that don't know, Survivor Research Network has just become a community interest company. And in recent weeks, we have been awarded a very small amount of money, actually not that small, in our eyes anyway, but I'm sure in other people's eyes it might look small. But to us, it's enormous. From Awards for All from the Big Lottery Fund, which means that in the short term, Survivor Research Network will continue to offer peer-to-peer support to people who are interested in and involved in research. So what we thought we'd do with today's session, rather than have us talking at you for an hour, which can be a bit boring, we thought what we'd do is invite you into a discussion on the process of doing survivor-led and user-led research. So Dina is going to do a presentation about her research, some research that she was involved in, in relation to the detention process under the Mental Health Act and ambivalence specifically to that process from people with lived experience. And then what we're going to do is invite you to critically reflect on that research, on the research process, and then to tell us from your perspective how that could have been done differently from a survivor and user perspective in relation to research. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dina Porsanidou, who's going to talk about the research that she was involved in. Dina.
Okay, hi guys. Thanks for that opportunity to be part of the panel. Can I have the first slide, Stephen, please?
Yeah, I'm quite right.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do today is just talk briefly about, as Jackie said, some research I was involved in. And the research was looking at AMP practice. AMPs are approved mental health professionals. And in England, at least, they are mental health professionals who execute functions under the Mental Health Act. For example, they coordinate Mental Health Act assessments. And also they make the application for people's detention. Involuntary hospitalization. Now, before I start, I need to say that throughout this brief talk, there will be references to quite difficult and distressing experiences like suicide, self-harm, forced treatment, physical restraint, and generally the traumas of involuntary hospitalization. And some of these things I have experienced too. Yeah, can I have the next slide, please?
Sorry, I'm struggling to.
That's okay.
I see. Yeah. Oh, no.
Basically, I thought of kind of framing the presentation around three key questions. Why is it important and even essential to listen to and value ambivalent voices, ambivalent mental health service user and survivor voices when it comes to psychiatric detention? And I will explain what I mean by ambivalent. Another question is what I see as an ambivalent stance towards psychiatric detention in the current socio-political economic context of mental health care in England. And also talk briefly about what the relevance of all this to the current policy context in England is. And by that, I mean the independent review of the Mental Health Act that happened in 2018, and also the white paper that resulted from the independent review. Can I have the next, please? Now, what I mean by ambivalence, I looked at one definition of ambivalence at the Collins Dictionary, and ambivalence is defined as the simultaneous existence of two opposed and conflicting attitudes, emotions, and sort of feelings. So basically, the way I see ambivalence is the way, like the ability to be able to negotiate and hold contradictory feelings and attitudes towards certain issues. The next, please. Now, just a minute. Yeah. So, as I said, I was involved in this piece of research looking at AMP, approved mental health professional practice. And in the context of that, there were some interviews carried out with service users who had experience of mental health act assessments and hence experience of encountering AMPs. And in those, in the interviews of the service users we spoke to, involuntary hospitalization, or sectioning, as we call it, was associated with being stigmatized within the mental health system, with trauma, with coercion. People talked about being restricted, physically restrained. They spoke about experiencing forced treatment. Also, they spoke about human rights violation, the fact that they felt they didn't have autonomy and choice. Also, they referred to the lack of therapeutic care whilst detained, and they depicted an atmosphere of fear and threat whilst they were in hospital under the Mental Health Act. But what is interesting, at least to me, is that at the same time, some of the people who spoke about the trauma of being detained also seem to regard their involuntary hospitalization as justified and beneficial. They felt it was the right thing to do and that it was helpful. And in their interviews, people associated sectioning with physical and material safety, and they spoke in terms of keeping in terms of detentions, having kept them alive, having saved their lives. And they also spoke about another benefit of being sectioned, the fact that they were able to secure necessary services when they left hospital. Next slide. I'm going to give you a couple of examples from these interview accounts. In the first example, a woman is talking about her experience, one of her experiences of detention. She says, I was sectioned, which I think I needed to, because I would have ended my life. I hate these bloody psychiatric hospitals. In my last Mental Health Act assessment, I was taken to this place of safety and possibly held there for hours and hours. The place of safety was a section 136 suite attached to a hospital. Dreadful place. I suppose they have them for people that self-harm. That was never me. I never self-harmed, but it was just a mattress on the floor. And it took 23 hours to get this assessment. Horrendous. I tried to get out at one stage. I had nothing. I'm just lying there. And then this private company, you know, the people that accompany you to take you to the hospital, they were the people that were so-called monitoring me. One of them fell asleep and the other one was on the mobile most of the time. And I saw my opportunity and thought, right, I'll get out of there now. But the doors were locked as it happened. And then he went flying after me and pulled me back, restrained me and laid me down on the mattress again. I've had flashbacks about that. I mean, that was probably the worst one of all. The police cells are not a place for a person, but I found a lot of the police very kind and caring. That experience, oh my God, there's a couple of nights I've woken up with, started screaming in the middle of night because memories of it. It was trauma. So it was trauma, but it saved her life. That was the gist of her account. Can I have the next slide, please? And the next. We don't have time to go through all this, but all of the interview accounts, the examples, but the slides will be available, so you'll be able to look at these in your own time. Somebody else said, I believe sectioning was the best thing. I actually like hospital because I believe it's like a reset for your mind. I was taking drugs at the time in the community and I wasn't trusting friends, family. I believe that in hospital, it's like a safe place where you can't get into my mind. It's a safe place and they are nice people, the staff, and you don't meet many nice people about. You get meals, you are looked after, a bed, somebody cares. So this is an account of a positive experience of sectioning. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, why I think it's important to listen to ambivalent voices and also positive experiences when it comes to sectioning. I think it's particularly important to listen to these voices in the context of an acute polarization that we see within the mental health user survivor community in England and generally in the UK, an acute polarization when it comes to sectioning. So on the one hand, there is an abolitionist stance towards sectioning. So people who think that detention should be banned. And on the other extreme, I would say, there is an often critical acceptance that we need to detain people in order to keep them safe and to keep others safe. And the abolitionist position links to the CRPD, which is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Well, I need to say here that I'm not an expert on the CRPD. I know there are people in the audience, I've noticed, that they have far more expertise to talk about CRPD. But I just wanted to mention the CRPD and the abolitionist stance. In my experience, people who draw on the CRPD to talk about banning detention, they put forward the Article 14 on the convention that says that parties shall ensure that persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others enjoy the right to liberty and security of person, and that the existence of a disability, and in this case a psychiatric and a psychosocial disability, shall in no case justify a deprivation of liberty. Next, please. Now, why I think it's important within that climate of polarization, why it is important to listen to ambivalent voices and even positive experiences when it comes to sectioning. I think staying ambivalent helps us to avoid binary positions, either or. I think by staying ambivalent, we can be open and critical. And we are able to engage fully with the complexity and the difficulty and the messiness of detention, which is a particularly contested and controversial issue. And we're able to ask difficult questions. I think by listening to a wide range of experiences, of service user experiences of detention, we can deepen our engagement with the issue of detention. We can deepen how we think about and understand sectioning. And by not dismissing, not discrediting ambivalent and positive service user experiences of detention. In other words, by acknowledging and recognizing the polyphony around this, a variety of perspectives, I think we can practice humility, which is an antidote in my experience and the way I feel about it, is an antidote to being dogmatic and to epistemic injustice. Now, I'll just say just one word about epistemic injustice. It's a situation where people are not considered as credible knowers of their experience. So basically, by not listening to ambivalent voices or positive experiences, we are basically telling these people that whatever they say does not have credibility. Next slide, please. And actually, the amazing Rai Waddingham, in her opening keynote on Monday, she spoke about messiness and the need for polyphony in mental health debates, which I thought was, and actually that's that's, you know, what I want to convey, what I want to what I want to sort of put forward in this presentation. And when I was thinking about ambivalence when it comes to detention, years ago, I came across a paper by Felicity Callard, who speaks about the necessity of ambivalence in psychiatric diagnosis debates. And she talks about the conceptual and potential ethical benefits of being ambivalent. And she talks about the need to keep in clear view grayer, more ambivalent accounts of psychiatric diagnosis, and the need to avoid premature certainty and foreclosure of possibilities of interpretation in diagnosis debates. And by staying ambivalent, it is possible, she says, to attend to voices that are seldom or never heard in those debates. And we can reach more open and balanced interrogations of the problems and the benefits of diagnosis. And I think these things can apply to other controversies in mental health, like detention. So I think I would like to kind of advocate for the indispensability of ambivalence when it comes to sectioning. Next slide, please. And a couple of weeks ago, I came across a paper, a blog actually, that looks at internal conflicts within movements for social change. And the psychiatric survivor movement is one of those movements. And the author says that by affirming and creatively combining complex, contradictory, paradoxical proofs, we make it possible to identify complex, higher order, synergistic solutions, to identify complex, more advanced and more collaborative solutions. Next slide, please. Now, how I see an ambivalent stance, an ambivalent position towards sectioning. I think staying ambivalent, we are able to, or we should, problematize detention as a conundrum, as a contested issue. Go back, Stephen.
Yeah.
So recognize the huge problems that detention comes with. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge, we need to situate detention in the current political economic context of mental health care in England, which is characterized by a lack of genuine and meaningful alternatives to sectioning. And these lack of alternatives is linked, for example, to a very acute shortage of mental health beds, and also is linked to a climate of austerity, at least for a decade in the last 10 years. And I think it's important to question, to interrogate abolition of psychiatric detention without genuine and meaningful alternatives, because say that we ban detention without alternatives, I think then we run the risk of going from psychiatric abuse to psychiatric neglect. And Helen Spandler wrote a really useful article in Asylum called From Psychiatric Abuse to Psychiatric Neglect, actually looking at these very issues. And I think being ambivalent and open towards psychiatric detention enables us to ask difficult questions that are often uncomfortable. For example, one of my questions is abolishing psychiatric detention in law, so in other words, is affecting legislative change enough, sufficient to ensure non-coercive inpatient mental health care? Is it enough to change things in legislation? Well, personally, I feel that we need change on multiple levels in inpatient mental health care in order to reach a kind of state of non-coerciveness. So we need legislative change, we need cultural change, change in organizational cultures, and change in staff mindsets, and also in change in terms of resources. For example, we need safe staffing levels and also funding for meaningful alternatives, for genuine alternatives to psychiatric detention. Can I have the next slide, please? I'll just give you an example from the interviews with in the research I was involved in, exactly talking about the lack of meaningful alternatives to involuntary hospitalization. A woman said, "My aim will be to go into a Soteria house and work through my psychosis there, and come out the other side, not medicated. But obviously, that's not available at the moment. So that makes it really hard." And people talked a lot, service users talked a lot about the lack of alternatives. Next slide. Now, what is the relevance of all this to the current policy context, which I said mainly by the current policy context, I mean the white paper on reforming the Mental Health Act. Apparently, there are 150 or so recommendations that came out of the Independent Mental Health Act review, but these recommendations are captured by 4 principles: choice and autonomy, least restriction, therapeutic benefit, and the person as an individual. But again, my question is, can recommendations in the white paper, in other words, can change in legislation make any difference in inpatient mental health care without cultural change and without change in resources and funding, including funding for meaningful alternatives? Next one. Go back. Now, I want to end by talking a little bit about my own experience of sectioning. That happened back in 2009. I was sectioned under Section 3 for 3 months between January and April 2009. And my experience of sectioning was particularly traumatic, and I survived, not thanks to sectioning, but in spite of it. And I just want to give you a little extract from my care notes that I requested and I looked at a couple of years after I got out of hospital. So this is from a nursing daily record on the 7th of February 2009. Very agitated this morning, trying to leave ward, very resistive and repeating same phrases over and over, escorted back to room on many occasions, 2 milligram lorazepam, PRN, given with effect after approximately 1 hour. Constantina was then calm for approximately 2 hours, then became even more agitated and resistive. Intramuscular 5 milligram haloperidol and 2 milligram lorazepam given in restraint. Staff had to hold Constantina in restraint, level 3, for approximately 20 minutes as she remained very agitated, eventually settled. Jigsaw puzzle undertaken as distraction with success, remains settled at time of report. So, and this was one of the occasions where I was physically restrained. Can I have the next slide, please? In the next 2 slides, I'm just showing you a couple of images, which are paintings by Alfred Kübing, an Austrian artist back in the beginning of the 20th century. And this one is called Terror. And I think it captures beautifully how terrified I felt on the ward, on Willow Ward, where I was sectioned at. And the next one is called Oppression. And we see a huge beast crushing somebody. And that's how I felt myself and my confidence was crushed on this ward. And I am showing these to convey the idea that for me, it's very difficult to maintain ambivalence because, like many people who have been sectioned, I have very strong emotional reactions to detention. I feel very angry about what happened to me. So this is not something I can be cool and calm and composed about. But in spite of that, as a researcher and as a service user, I strive towards maintaining ambivalence. I strive towards being able to hold other perspectives, look at other perspectives. I think that's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Dina. That was fabulous. Well done. It was. I love the fact that you explained everything, and I felt like I was left with very few questions about what you meant in relation to the terms that you used and the way that you spoke about what you were doing. Thank you very much. What we'd like to do now, with your permission, is to open this discussion up to you, the audience. So our question is, what do we bring? What would we bring as user potential, if not, user or survivor researchers? What would we bring to this process, and how would we do it differently? So we'll take questions from the floor. If you just want to put your hand up, or if you don't want to speak in person, please feel free to put your thoughts and feelings in the chat.
Can I add something here, Jackie?
Oh.
Just a little bit about the process of my involvement in this research. As I said, and actually this is an example of how often we as survivor researchers are involved in mainstream projects. And I was involved in the last minute because somebody else couldn't do it. Yeah. And so there was no plan for involving a service user researcher in this research. And I'm not critical of the academics because that was, they're not, they were doing a mainstream, a piece of mainstream research. And interestingly, I discussed with the principal investigator whether I would say to the people that I interviewed. I only did very few of the interviews. whether I would actually say to the people that I am a service user with experience of detention, and we decided not to. So that, of course, posed issues for me, because I was dying to say to the people, I know what you mean. I mean, I've been there. I know what you mean. So yeah. Just so that people understand, have a little bit of context in terms of how I got involved. And I was mainly employed to do the data analysis of the service user interviews.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks very much. And I fully understand your frustration, because there's somebody who works within sort of peer support. Yeah, you would want to share, absolutely. So do we have any comments, questions, thoughts, reflections, or anything else from our audience today? If you do, please put your hand up, please let us know.
Hello, everybody. My name's Michael Llewellyn-Cox, and I haven't got my video on because I've got my nostrils stuffed with cotton wool.
Oh, bless you.
Like a tap. But first off, a bit of background. I experienced cyclical unipolar depression from late teens, but I am a retired ASW. I've been retired in 1999, so it's a long time ago. A couple of things really about the thank you, Constantina. That was smashing. There are a couple of things related to that. In the 90s, and I can't remember the exact date, but in the 90s, the European Union did some research into psychiatry, and I participated in that, and part of that was that I was seriously questioning why hospital, and why psychiatry in particular. My questions were rejected by the European Union, but it was an interesting set of research. The alternatives to hospital, something like the wonderful Leeds House, which is absolutely smashing, or used to be certainly. And there are other things with psychiatry as well. The other point that I'd like to make is from an ASW point of view, and that is the law isn't really used properly by many ASWs. It allows, or certainly allowed, I don't know what the current situation is, but it allowed 14 days to make an assessment under the Mental Health Act. And the doctors had to wait while the ASW investigated and talked to and worked with the person who was the subject of the compulsory admission or the attempt to it. That could make an awful lot of difference as to how somebody was treated. The other point I'd like to make is that, and it's certainly relevant with things that Constantina was experiencing. I was initially based in a psychiatric hospital as a social worker in mental health. Now, what I found working in psychiatry, and not just one hospital, but working with other hospitals as well, that there was a minimum amount of qualified nurses, mental health nurses, who were very cynical and had a leaning towards violence. Most of the nurses were good, were fine, but they had this minority had a huge influence on the rest of the nursing staff, who were afraid if they said anything, they would get leaned on by the minority.
Thank you, Mike.
Culture.
In the interest of hearing quite a few voices in this process, Mike, thank you very much for both of the points. But if it's okay with you, I'm going to open the floor up again, because I'd really like to hear from some people who have some lived experience and also have that interest in research in relation to what they would do differently, and possibly how they would frame the research differently, how they would undertake the research differently, what they themselves think is needed in relation to ambivalence and detention.
Can I also say that ASW means approved social worker, which is the it used to happen before the approved mental health professionals. So they were the people who were making the application for detentions.
Liz, I can see your hand up. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, hi, and thanks, Dina. Stephen actually wrote out the question I would have been interested to ask, and I'm going to put it to you, Dina. What would have been done differently, in your own, based on what you have shared with us and everything? How would your question, like if you're not just Stephen said what might have been different about the research if designed by survivor researchers, and I would kind of be a little bit more specific to ask you, if you were to, looking back now, if you were to design the research question from lived experience, how would it have been different? What difference would you think might have been in the questions you would ask the people you were interviewing?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, there was an interview schedule that we were kind of asked to follow. And the thing is that this piece of research was focusing on the AMP practice. So basically asking people about their experience of the practice of the approved mental health professional in the Mental Health Act assessment. And it was interesting that a lot of people did not remember their Mental Health Act assessments, as I don't remember mine either, because I was so distressed, so ill and drugged up. So I don't remember, but I had one. I checked later. So interestingly, then, all these questions that this research was asking, for example, was your approved mental health professional, was the AMP a nurse or a social worker or a psychologist? People didn't have a clue. Because I mean, A, the AMP didn't tell them, B, some didn't remember having a mental health assessment. So it seems as if the people who designed this research didn't take into account enough how ill, how distressed the service users were at the time when they had the Mental Health Act assessments. And I think, you know, I would have taken that into account if I was to design this research. And I actually told the principal investigator, are you sure that people will be able to answer questions like that? So, of course, people did not answer questions like that, but they spoke about their detentions because that's what stayed with them. That's what stayed with me, not my mental health act assessment. And I'm not, I mean, and of course, that's one of the reasons why there isn't much research on the actual process of mental health act assessments, because people don't remember. I'm not saying there shouldn't be, but for example, this is one example of how I would have used my lived experience perspective and my own experience of detention and the process to actually frame the interview schedule. I wouldn't be focusing on, you know, do you think it would have been better if your, you know, if the professional identity of your, you know, AMP was a social worker? I mean, I don't have a clue.
Do you think that it would have been interesting to hear or to ask, or maybe the professional researchers thought of it, or professional academics in researchers in mental health thought of asking, to what extent people felt matched or understood by the AMP or whoever was part of it?
I mean, people, I mean,
match ethnicity, gender, class experience. You know, there's so many things when you're trying to contextualize what happens to people. Oh, it's all the hidden things that are always forgotten about, like the fact that I've been involved in a bit of research where in order to take someone to safety and or for themselves or some other people, to break down the door, leave the dog, you know, grab the person, take them miles away and then leave the dogs or the cats or maybe the fish, I don't know, but certainly dogs or animals without making sure there's anyone to mind them. And there's so many other examples I could go on, but I'm going to stop because I see other questions in the chat. Thanks, Dina.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks very much for your comments and your questions. Ute put a comment in the chat, and I'd like to invite them to say something about the comment itself and to share some of their thoughts if they're willing.
Yeah, is it okay if I just talk?
Of course.
I am really glad to be able to join. At the moment, I'm myself part of a research team, and in particular of groups of so-called peer researchers or researchers with lived experience. We are doing interviews with people who work in services as peer workers. My reflection concerns the format of the single interview, because so we have done loads of interviews and of course reflected on this. And what we found is what can happen in the time of a single interview. So there's the notions of dominant thinking or just available knowledge, which relates to this is how systems run. And I think that even if you're really generous and very open, you're still bound by the format. You're bound by what people can have experienced. And I feel a bit worried about this in regards to results that repeat what the system has to offer and what the system hasn't to offer, and we can't go beyond that. So I have been thinking about, well, how could we do something like research workshops? Could we bring in, like short films showing how peer respites work? What is my role as a researcher? Should I pretend to be that neutral, that I have no stance towards a system where I know that even the feelings and the thinking of people are not informed, have no chance to try different versions? And what I was thinking about, I really like the ambivalence, but my skeptical thought was, I'm afraid it's not enough. Yes, what this is really means, like having discussions in our research teams about, you know, what could we change? Would it still be okay if we do research, if we would do workshops and bring in like really different examples? Like one story somebody told me, this is with regards to sectioning. A person, a survivor in Germany who works as a peer worker, did a short talk in a conference that was attended by loads of social psychiatrists. This is very German. There's people like to say, oh, we are very social. And then he said, oh, section saved my life, like kind of, you know, sectioning saved my life. And of course, all of the people were clapping wildly. And I sat in the audience and I felt like really horrible. And again, afterwards, I met another person and she made me thinking about the subject. She said, yeah, but they don't talk about like, has he ever learned to take responsibility, to plan ahead differently before it comes to the worst escalation of crisis? And so, I mean, there's just so many ideas that if you're limited to the, I come back to the subject of research, to the face-to-face whatsoever 45 minutes to 1 hour interview where everyone is a bit nervous, we may not be able to create the room for such kind of experiences and thoughts, to create a learning opportunity and bring in other topics and make understand that maybe a different way of thinking and feeling would be needed. Anyway, I said a lot around a very, how do you say, it's a very difficult topic, and I really enjoy that you bring up the importance of ambivalence, but please also understand that my reflections come from my heart and are related to what's my responsibility in the research team, where there's also user and survivor researchers thinking about what are we allowed to bring in order not only to have data, sorry, I had that, to have people responding to a kind of thinking that is very dependent on what they know from the existing system.
Can I, Dina?
Yeah.
Would you be okay if I responded to that comment?
No, of course not.
Okay. I don't do interviews, or occasionally I do interviews, but I use creative arts-based approaches in working with people using participatory action research. So we co-created as a group a body mapping evaluation tool that we used not only to document our lived experience, our past, our present, and our hoped for future, but also we filmed each other talking through our body maps and made participatory videos that we felt best represented our lived experience and what we hoped for in the future. And I use photo voice and theatre of the oppressed and poetry and as many creative forms as I can in working with people like myself with lived experience. So I'm completely with you, Ute, in relation to the interview and how things could be done very differently. And I think the creative arts have a lot to offer.
And music, Jackie?
I beg you, and music, yes, Mike, won't miss music, absolutely. We had music at the beginning of our videos and some people had it at the end as well. So people chose their own pieces of music. So I completely agree. We need to rethink and reframe and be as innovative and creative as we can in the research process when working with people.
Can I say something here? Yeah, I totally agree. And of course, I mean, you know, one 45-minute interview is very limiting. And I'm with you where, you know, about the use of creative approaches. But whatever we do, we can't dismantle the power dynamics that are there anyway, in terms of who we are as researchers, what do we represent, what we represent, and the other people as participants. So, I mean, I can go on about it, but, and of course the power stuff we need to be aware of. Whatever we do, it can't be totally equal. It can't be totally democratic because of the inherent power dynamics. Because we represent an institution, we have more power in relation to the participants. So I totally agree, but I think that we shouldn't be under the illusion that, you know, changing the research method, we're gonna, you know, dismantle power hierarchies, and we're gonna be talking to service users as equal just because we are service users ourselves, because we are very different from them, potentially, in terms of class, race, educational background, gender, and whatever. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that. I totally agree with you, and with you, Jackie, but, you know, we need to be, you know, aware of our limitations. And survivor research can't solve the problem of detention. You need you need a political will and top-down will to be able to resolve some of this. I think what we can do is open up a space where different perspectives can be heard, or ambivalent perspectives and negative experiences like mine, and also positive experiences. But that's all we can do.
Yeah, and on that note, we've reached 3 o'clock, so I'm not sure where we stand in terms of going over time. And if anybody else has any other questions or any burning desire to say to finish us off for the day.
Yeah, I think we're probably not allowed to go over time, Jackie. But
I didn't
to see if Amy's still around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd like to say thank you to everybody for attending and for remaining during the session. And I'd also like to remind people that we have online support groups. At the moment, they're running on a bi-monthly basis, but we're hoping to increase that. So Stephen has kindly put the link into the chat. So please do sign up to the newsletter and let us know if you'd like to join in. We've been
you can save the chat just by clicking on those 3 dots.
Do you want to say that again, Stephen?
You can save the chat for the links by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat box.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And then clicking save chat.
Great stuff.
Hi, here's Amy. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, just popping back to say thank you so much. That went really quickly. An hour always seems to go so quickly. I'm gonna end the stream and the recording now. So thank you to anyone who's watching this later.
Thank you.